And before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm here on the homelands of the Penobscot Nation in Maine. I want to pay my respects to the ancestors, and to the emerging and future leaders of these lands and waters. And I do this land acknowledgement because I'm a settler scholar, and it's really critical for me to, work to make visible the ongoing dimensions of settler colonialism, the ongoing structures that are often rendered invisible. And as part of my work, and certainly what I'll be talking about today, is how do we kind of think through and create mechanisms that can act against the legacies of settler colonialism and the harm and the violence that has meant for Indigenous peoples around the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about local context, the project that I've been involved in for the last, I keep saying 10 years, but I think I've been saying 10 years for 4 years, so it's nearly 14 years. And importantly, I just want to also acknowledge my co-directors in this work, Kim Kristen, Maui Hudson from the Whakatohea Nation, and James Francis from the Penobscot Nation, where I am today. So this project really sits firmly within a framework around Indigenous data sovereignty. Indigenous data sovereignty really emerged as a discourse over the last 5 years, really thinking about what is it that, the value of data, and thinking about the ways in which Indigenous peoples have rights to and interests in data, not only how data can support governance for Indigenous communities, but also making sure that Indigenous people are part of making decisions around how their data is governed into the future. Indigenous data sovereignty really brings in multiple discourses that have been ongoing in thinking about Indigenous rights, particularly Indigenous treaty rights, cultural and intellectual property rights, and really critically, Indigenous research ethics and data ethics. So one of the kind of key guiding principles that have come out of the Indigenous data sovereignty movement over the last 3 years are these care principles for Indigenous data governance. These complement the FAIR principles that were developed maybe over 10 years ago to encourage data and the production of data to be findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. The care principles for Indigenous data governance were developed as a complement to the FAIR principles, but really centre Indigenous interests in relationship to data as relations. So kind of pointing to the way in which data should have collective benefit for Indigenous people, that there should be authority to control, the different relationships of responsibility, and of course ethics. In many ways, the care principles for Indigenous data governance really centre the relationship between people and data, and where data comes from. So under the care principles, and the care principles really at a higher kind of policy level. And so then over the last couple of years, it's been really thinking about, well, how do we operationalise the care principles? What does that look like in different contexts? So from Indigenous community contexts to repositories to publishing contexts. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the labels and the notices today as kind of just two mechanisms that are part of the toolkit that can lead to the operationalisation of the care principles, but also kind of about putting Indigenous authority and, centering relationships of responsibility and collective benefit as part of our work in relationship to supporting Indigenous people. So I just want to run through some of the kind of problems that really led to the development of the labels and the notices. And this is really kind of centering around questions of open data, big data, and open science, but really also addressing legacies of colonialism and the kind of study of Indigenous people. So one of the core challenges that we have is that every Indigenous community has enormous collections of cultural heritage and data held in archives, museums, libraries, and repositories. But whilst that is a major issue for Indigenous people in terms of finding their collections and getting access to the collections, what compounds that particular problem is that there's significant information about these collections including names and proper provenance information, is actually missing. It was never considered to be important at the time of kind of studying and the kind of more extractive research projects within Indigenous community contexts. One extra concern is that Indigenous people and communities are largely not the legal rights holders. And this is kind of where there's an ongoing legacy of copyright and the challenges that copyright produces for Indigenous people, which means that they are not, if they're not the legal rights holders over their cultural heritage and data within museums, archives and libraries, it means that they can't control or make decisions over how that material is utilised. So in many ways, we're thinking about histories of property law and copyright being a form of property law and how that has worked against Indigenous interests. So these issues of responsibility and ownership, as well as some of the significant mistakes that sit within the metadata, continue into the digital lives of this material. It's really hard to go back and update that metadata. And then this is the additional component of that is that there are actually more researchers working in Indigenous communities than ever before. And foundationally, many of the research practices that we're dealing with in terms of the historical legacies haven't really foundationally changed. So how do we kind of create mechanisms that, allow for a shift in research practice so that Indigenous names, Indigenous people are partners in research, and how does that change kind of what's produced in the research process? So one of the challenges, and just kind of, this is kind of going just a little bit deeper into some of those points that I was just making a minute ago, is it's very difficult to govern Indigenous data, if that is kind of a guiding principle of Indigenous data sovereignty, if you can't actually find Indigenous data. And so this is kind of a good example of one of this that I have here, which is the James Neal papers at the American Philosophical Society. I was in the stacks one day at Penobscot Nation language materials with the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. And I just turned around and I saw these papers sitting next to the Penobscot papers. And you can see from this photograph that it references the Brazilian Quiapo Indians. And I asked the archivist, how would the Quiapo, if they wanted to find this material, know it was here in the first place? Is it searchable? Is it findable in any of the kind of subject guides that are available? And the archivist told me that it wasn't. There was no way that you could actually find this material unless you were actually in the stacks looking at the boxes like we were that day. And so this kind of challenge of actually finding Indigenous material, if it's not properly named, if there isn't proper provenance information, is an enormous project, and it's kind of at the base level very, very difficult to do. So you can't govern Indigenous data if you can't find Indigenous data. And this is kind of like speaks to this larger challenge of histories of documenting Indigenous peoples and communities. The amount of material that is in museums around the world from Indigenous communities is extensive. This is just an example of some of the kinds of material that you find, from cultural heritage material to plant specimens. This is from the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804 in the United States, which is foundationally built on native knowledge. The expedition was not possible without guidance from Indigenous people across the country about how to go across the country for Lewis and Clark. But this is also an illustration of the kinds of data about Indigenous people that were collected from, at all points of engagement with Indigenous people. This is an estimate of the number of houses and the number of people that were being encountered along the expedition, as well as kind of collecting the plant samples and kind of noting how native communities had been using particular kinds of plants as medicinal uses. So the collections are enormous. And this kind of challenge of not having control and not having ownership of that material has really led to a number of challenges facing Indigenous communities. So not only finding those collections, but then also getting access to them and also being able to make decisions about how that material should be circulated into the future. So, you know, the project that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about in a minute, the traditional knowledge labels, really emerged from this challenge that if Indigenous people are not the legal rights holders, they can't use Creative Commons, they can't use any kind of licensing mechanisms because they're not the legal rights holders. What else could you do? What else could you develop that allows for cultural authority and voice and protocols to come back into the record in a different kind of way that both alerts new users to Indigenous community protocols being present and also kind of activates engagement with Indigenous communities in a really different kind of way? So the traditional knowledge labels are really machine readable and human readable digital tags. By human readable, we mean something that is visually recognizable by us as humans, something that we see and kind of go, okay, we know what that is. And the machine readability of these labels is in the kind of permanent identifiers that sit behind them. There's about 20 of these traditional knowledge labels, and they do a lot of work of bringing Indigenous community protocols back into records. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what that looks like in a minute. But what's important to know about this project is that it was developed with community partnership over a really long period of time, slowly developing the labels in response to communities' expressed needs. And then as this project has grown across multiple different countries, working out the different ways in which those labels can be articulated by different communities. So you can see that there's an attribution label, a culturally sensitive label, a seasonal label. These are the three examples that I wanted to speak to you about today. The attribution label is a really important label, and almost every community that is utilising the TK labels starts with the attribution label, because the attribution label brings names back. Names matter, communities' names matter. And this attribution label asks for, into the future, those names to be connected to that material. If it's been excluded, putting it back into the record and actually having that carry forward so that those names are remembered, and so there is a cultural memory of those names and of those communities. The culturally sensitive label speaks a little bit more to different kinds of material, different kinds of content, material that might not have had been connected to communities over long periods of time. This is particularly for language materials, for instance, but also to address kind of derogatory framing around Indigenous interests that kind of often sits around particular kinds of material. That's often census material, also derogatory names that are physically being used by people. I'm not going to say them here, but I'm sure that some of you can understand what they are and why it's problematic that they get continually recirculated. The TK seasonal label is a really interesting label, and it does particular work to connect knowledge to land. Our current frameworks don't really allow for that, and certainly property law itself likes to keep intellectual property on one hand and real property, land-based property, separate from each other. This seasonal label weaves these back together in the sense that certain kinds of songs, certain kinds of knowledge should only be shared at certain times of the year, and that is conditional upon the changing seasons or different kinds of ways in which that knowledge is shared. So for example, certain songs around harvesting sweetgrass only happen during the summer months when sweetgrass is being harvested. Certain kinds of stories around bears, for instance, are only told during the summer. You don't ever tell bear stories in the winter. So this seasonal label allows for a kind of a nuancing and understanding of the content itself. So this is just an example of an attribution label being utilised by the Scowlitz Band of the Stolog First Nation in what's now known as British Columbia. This is a kind of an important dimension of the labels in terms of their flexibility and the way in which they are able to really centre Indigenous sovereign interests. So there is the icon itself that remains stable across every kind of context because it needs to be internationally recognised. But But the way in which the label is described, every community has the right to make that description themselves. And so you can see here in this example, the attribution has been customized to mean squix quas tect muk in Hulkamalem. And then there's a description around attribution and why the Scarlets are utilizing this label to respond to historical inaccuracies or the ways in which history has not necessarily been told properly, but also to allow for Scarlets to actually, be recognised as the holders and caretakers of not only their lands and resources, but also their knowledge as well. So this is kind of an example of the context where the Scarlets are utilising the traditional knowledge labels, which is in a virtual museum context where they're sharing a range of histories and stories for different kinds of understanding of the Scarlets' history around burial mounds. You can see that up in the corner, the Scarlets decided to use 4 traditional knowledge labels, the attribution one, which I just showed you, also the outreach label, the non-commercial label, and the verified label, all doing work to indicate this is a community-based process, that it was entered into according to Scarlet's protocol, and that made it feel, that meant that people who are participating in this project are comfortable sharing this knowledge publicly, but not for commercial purposes. This is an example of the labels being utilised within a digital publishing context with Ravenspace at University of British Columbia. This is another example of the labels doing certain kinds of work to both be part of ensuring appropriate attribution, but also kind of speaking to the significance of cultural protocols and those being recognised for readers of this digital publication. So entering into the conversations with the Glamon Elder really is a prompt to, think about how one is a respectful guest in the storytelling that is going to be encountered in this digital publishing context. These are the 4 chapters of the book around territory, around colonialism, around community, and around wellness. And you can see that the labels have been utilised in different ways across those chapters. For instance, in the colonialism chapter, you're sensitive utilised, and again, the culturally sensitive labels talking about sensitive information, sensitive histories, where there needs to be care and thought given to what's not only what's being read, but how one talks about these histories. This is an example of the labels being utilised within a curriculum context, within a university context of the University of Tasmania in Australia. And again, this is kind of bringing in recognition of Indigenous authority. This in the University of Tasmania, all undergraduate students are being asked to take this particular course. The course is being developed with the Palawa elders. They really wanted to mark this course with their intent, their protocols. So they chose several different labels that they wanted to utilise that helped the students understand, as well as the faculty that are teaching this curriculum, that there are very clear Palawa interests, not only in attribution, but why they're sharing this information in the first place. This is an example of the labels being utilised in another context in Australia at the moment around the first Royal Commission around histories of colonialism for Victorian First Nations in Australia. This is the Yurok Justice Commission. So the Yurok Justice Commission is centering Indigenous data sovereignty and data governance, particularly around the submissions that are coming in for this Royal Commission, but also utilising the labels to kind of demarcate how and to ensure that particular kinds of information that is shared with the Commission is looked after, respected, and properly attributed. So the example that I want to give you now is a little bit more in depth in relationship to what do the labels do within digital infrastructures themselves. It's one thing to put the labels on curriculum and on digital publishing context, it's another thing for them to be embedded as particular kinds of metadata within the digital infrastructures, whether that's Dublin Core or Darwin Core. So this example is from actually about 40 kilometres or about 60 miles from where I am now on the Passamaquoddy homelands in Maine. These were sound recordings that were made, these were the first sound recordings made on native lands in the United States. And they were made as a particular kind of sound experiment for a researcher who was heading to Hopi and Zuni to do some similar sound recordings and wanted to test the capability of the phonograph. So there were 31 wax cylinders that were made in this sound experiment when Jesse Fuchs came to Calais, Maine. And for nearly 100 years, those sound recordings were not returned to Indigenous communities. They were missing, and then they were at Harvard University, and then they were at the Library of Congress. And if there's one thing that is deeply challenging to understand about not only the enormity of Indigenous collections, is that mostly these collections were not produced for Indigenous people. There was no expectation that these materials would be returned to Indigenous communities, which compounds many of the problems that we encounter in not only making these collections digitally available to communities now, but at that core level of actually finding these collections. So this is kind of what the catalogue record at the Library of Congress looked like prior to doing the work with Passamaquoddy tribal elders to kind of understand the wax cylinders in a different kind of way. You can see from this record that it's actually quite an impoverished record. We know quite a lot about the recordings, how long they are. We know very, very little about the content of those recordings. Fuchs named them the Passamaquoddy War Song and the Trading Song. That's all the information he had. And of course, the Passamaquoddy sound recordings are in Passamaquoddy. And so until people who speak Passamaquoddy can listen to them, we don't know anything about the content itself and kind of what's actually there. So in this work with the Library of Congress and the Passamaquoddy Nation, we have kind of now much more updated record with an enormous amount of cultural knowledge and traditional knowledge shared back to the Library of Congress. If you go to this record, you'll see there's actually pages more of information that's here. You can see from this updated record that the Passamaquoddy titles for the songs are actually included here. And you'll also see that there's kind of more information in the summary, as well as who were the various singers of the songs as well. You'll also see the traditional knowledge labels that are sitting there. There's 3 of them: the attribution to bring Passamaquoddy cultural authority and naming back into the record, outreach, the intent for Passamaquoddy in sharing these songs and to still be sharing these songs with various publics is one around education and learning for people to know more about Passamaquoddy, but on Passamaquoddy terms. And also the non-commercial label, kind of really indicating that from a Passamaquoddy standpoint, these songs are not to be used in commercial context. So kind of speaking to the degree of respect that Passamaquoddy are asking in sharing these songs with the public. But what's also important about this particular project is where the labels sit as part of a rights advisory now. I think in the previous record I showed you before, there was just Harvard University as the copyright holder of these songs. Now in the rights advisory, the traditional knowledge labels have been standardized as part of the rights advisory moving forward. And you can also see that they're the first rights that are being recognized here. So the rights advisory being flexible enough to include cultural rights of Passamaquoddy alongside any other legal rights that might sit and might vest with these recordings. So all of this kind of work is kind of like the images that I just showed you before from the kind of public facing record. But what sits behind that is also really interesting, and I wanted to share that with you today. Digital infrastructures are not neutral. They carry the bias of all the other kinds of frameworks and social frameworks that sit around us. And so here the Passamaquoddy traditional knowledge labels have been added into the rights field at Dublin Core. And I think also probably one of the most transformative dimensions of this project is as we kind of realize that Indigenous protocols, Indigenous names, Indigenous rules needed to be added, not back into only the public-facing records, but into the digital infrastructures themselves, we often find that there's not necessarily a field for that. It wasn't created to include Indigenous information in this way. And so within the JSON record at the Library of Congress, they've now created a field for traditional knowledge labels. And what that means is that any Indigenous community that has material at the Library of Congress and also has traditional knowledge labels can actually add their labels into it in a different way. So the work that the Passamaquoddy have done over the last 5 years to transform their own records has also led to a transformation within the larger Library of Congress infrastructure itself. And that's really significant for other tribal interests. So if we developed the traditional knowledge labels really to respond to some of these challenges around legacy collections, around collections, historical collections, we also understood that we have a range of new kinds of challenges, particularly within the sciences around Indigenous data, and particularly Indigenous data that's coming out of the genomic sciences. So we developed the biocultural labels, and the biocultural labels really make an intervention at the level of research and at the level of engaging with Indigenous communities around other kinds of collections, particularly those that are in herbariums and in different kinds of biological contexts. So there are, these are the range of biocultural labels that we've developed, and they work in a very similar way to the traditional knowledge labels in the sense that they have these icons that are a label, and then they allow each community customizes the text that sits alongside these. But importantly, you kind of see that these labels really emphasize different kinds of consent and permissions, but also the willingness and the desire to be part of collaborations and partnerships. And so these are really forward-facing labels in the sense that they're encouraging a different kind of research practice, particularly within kind of biocultural environments where samples and sequences are, often number in the hundreds of thousands and the millions. And so this is kind of allows us to scale this project in a really different kind of way. This is an example of the traditional knowledge and biocultural labels being utilised within a context, particularly of the Whakatohea Nation in New Zealand. And this is both an example that the Whakatohea are doing genetic sampling of green-lipped mussels, partly because they have marine interests in relationship to mussel farming. They kind of want to know where these mussels come from and their relationship to the kind of ways in which they're farming them on their waters. But also, and this is kind of the slide on the where the traditional knowledge labels are, they also have songs and chants that are connected to particular parts of their territory that also tell about the ways in which the certain kinds of stories are shared across these spaces. So it's an interesting kind of example because they're in this example, it's clear that some of the genetic sequences that are being produced through this research are connected to particular songs. So the labels do three key things. They speak to provenance and proper provenance and provenance information being key to our metadata futures. They also bring cultural protocols back into the record in a different kind of way. So recognizing that there are particular kinds of responsibilities and obligations around listening to, accessing and sharing Indigenous cultural material. And they also talk about permissions, the different kinds of care that communities want around how this material should be shared and under what circumstances. So if we developed the traditional knowledge labels for Indigenous communities and with Indigenous partnership, we also recognise that institutions and researchers also need particular kinds of tools. So this is where we started to develop the notices. We have a variety of notices, open to collaborate, which is probably sits at that first level. It allows institutions to mark an intent to be doing this work with Indigenous communities, to identify collections and to assist in the labour of finding Indigenous collections, and then working to add Indigenous cultural authority back into the institutional record. But also the biocultural and the traditional knowledge notice, making different kinds of disclosures that there are Indigenous rights and interests that need to be considered moving forward. So this is just an example of the Open to Collaborate notice being utilised by Simon Fraser University in their Northwest Coast Image Archive. This is the most trafficked archive. Most people come to Simon Fraser University's libraries to see these Northwest Coast images, but the Northwest Coast images don't have great provenance. There's very few names. Sometimes there's community names, First Nation names next to a photograph, but often there is not. And so what this notice is doing is indicating the intent to actually start working to add proper attribution, proper provenance back into these First Nation photographs. This is an example of the Open to Collaborate notice being utilised within a university open access repository. Again, this open access repository has a variety of Aboriginal interests that are in it. And this notice starts to indicate that their university is willing to go into this repository and to start disclosing those Indigenous rights and interests. This is a use of the Open to Collaborate notice within a geological and genomic database, GEOME, which holds genomic sequences and holds the metadata that sits alongside those genomic sequences. GEOME is particularly interested in using the traditional knowledge and biocultural notices because they are a space where they're kind of building out critical metadata that is associated with those sequences. So whilst they might have had fields for permit information previously, they did not have information around any kind of traditional knowledge or biocultural information that was being shared by communities, nor kind of how communities anticipate and expect that material to be utilised into the future through collaboration and different kinds of consent and permissions. This is one of the examples of the biocultural labels, biocultural notice, sorry, being utilised within a vaccinium database, kind of indicating that they're accompanying cultural rights and responsibilities. So when the genetic sequence that is available in this database is downloaded, this notice indicates that there are Indigenous interests that need to be considered by researchers when they access this genomic sequence. And this is just a project that we are doing with Maine University and Maine eDNA, or Maine Environmental DNA project that has been established here. And this is to kind of think about what does it mean for researchers who are working in the field and collecting different kinds of samples, mean to be connecting those samples when they're being created with Indigenous communities today, with present day Indigenous communities. This project is kind of working out what the workflow looks like from a kind of a sampling event on Indigenous lands, where those interests are marked within the sample from the very beginning, how that travels back to the lab, what that looks like, and then also within the kind of data archiving and the final reports then move not only within the kind of database for Maine eDNA, but then move into national databases. And how do you keep this provenance information as critical metadata all the way along the data ecosystem? So the challenges that we're kind of facing and kind of how we're thinking about a lot of this work and where the labels and the notices sit is really working out what does proper provenance look like and how do we keep it as we move across different kinds of ecosystems. So from communities to institutions to aggregate users and to publishers. And just finally, a couple of examples in relationship to how researchers are starting to utilise the notices to promote different kinds of transparency and visibility of Indigenous rights within their own research practices. This is ORCID. This is a really important kind of way for researchers to make visible their research to other researchers, as well as kind of to connect into publications. And so we utilise ORCID within our local contexts hub when researchers are signing up to kind of authenticate who is joining the hub and kind of where they're located within a different kind of university context. But conversely, ORCID is also interested in making visible when researchers are utilising the traditional knowledge and biocultural notices within their own research. And then, of course, what does that start to look like within publishing contexts? So this is an example within JSTOR of where the traditional knowledge and biocultural notices could be for particular kinds of herbarium samples. This happens to be the Lewis and Clark herbarium samples that we're working on with the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, where these are kept at the moment. What does it look like to add Indigenous interests back into these specimens? And what kinds of new conversations are possible when communities are also engaged within that process? This is just an example of what the preferred approach for including the notices and the labels by data site kind of what the attributes are at that kind of data attribute level, and thinking through where they sit across the different kinds of schemas. So in this instance, they're working largely with Dublin Core, again, kind of including them within the rights framework. And so just to answer that question of how the labels and the notices are delivered, they're delivered through the Local Contexts Hub. The Local Contexts Hub is where you register if you're a researcher or if you're an institution or if you're a community. And it does important kind of communication. It's a communication space. It allows institutions to tag Indigenous communities who are part of a collection and to start a different kind of communication around how the communities want to be part of engaging with their collections and different kinds of information that might be shared back with the institution, but also letting communities know where their collections actually are. The labels and the notices have unique identifiers, and this is kind of an example of the API for the Local Context Hub in the delivery of the labels and the notices. So if you're interested in talking or thinking through the use of the labels or the notices in different kinds of projects that you might be thinking about, please feel free to get in contact with us at Local Contexts, and you can also follow us on social media, where there's a range of different kinds of stories of the use of the labels consistently being told. So I am going to stop there and allow for some questions that might come up. And I just want to thank you again so much for your time and for joining us for this session.